Oh, it's been known as Horse Creek Valley for as long as anyone can remember. The valley brims with tales of those who came and built empires, and those who passed through leaving only their footprints. You see, from the very beginning, everyone left a mark in this valley, from people whose names were known to millions to those whose names have long since been forgotten. Horse Creek has flowed in and out of each of their lives, weaving together a tale that's worth the telling. What today is called the Fall Line is the remnant of a 300-million-year-old coastline. Once, ocean waves crested over what would become Aiken County, South Carolina, and lapped upon the shores of what would become Horse Creek Valley. Each new tribe and colony who happened upon this area discovered the resources of this geographic wonder.
You know, if you lived right on that fall line there, in other words, where you could no longer, in historic times, take a boat up the river because of the rocks. And of course, that would mean Indians could get across the river pretty easily in times of low water. That made a great congregating place, but also from a locational standpoint, it is sort of situated at a place where 2, 3, maybe 4 major environments are all within a day's walk. And once you leave that little magic intersection of all those environments or micro-environments, then you lose some diversity, either going up into the Piedmont or going down in the coastal plain.
The evidence of this environmental nexus can be traced to the Clovis people some 13,000 years ago. They could reach a rich deposit of chert, the perfect material for making tools and weapons, in just a day's walk downriver from their valley.
Now, in the area of what we know as Langley Pond today, of course, which is a modern creation by our society, before it was dammed up, it was a good free-flowing stream and would have been quite attractive to early peoples, early hunters and gatherers. We know this because diagnostic stone spears and axes and scrapers and pottery and so forth have been found actually in abundance in the bottom of Langley Pond as they would drain it and so forth. In fact, one good Clovis point has come from Langley Pond, and we've recorded it in the South Carolina Paleo-Indian Point database. Location, 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 even in prehistory.
In the centuries before Europeans arrived in the Southeast, there were Native American communities across the landscape. There were some places like the Savannah River Valley that was abandoned. There were other places like that across the Southeast where people had lived and then moved away for reasons we don't understand. But pretty much there were people everywhere.
Those Native Americans were about to meet a new breed of man, one with unfamiliar ambitions and an intense desire to call this land home. When the European colonists anchored their ships on the coast of South Carolina, they intended to stay.
Well, Charleston was settled in 1670, and right away, the colonists at Charleston tried to establish friendly relations with all the Indians in the surrounding area because they were dependent on those people for food, plus they didn't want to be attacked and driven out by local Indian populations, the numbers of which they didn't really know.
In 1674, an early Carolina colonist named Dr. Henry Woodward was invited by the Westo Indians to visit their village near Horse Creek Valley. Woodward wrote, "The next day I viewed the town, which was built in a confused manner, consisting of many long houses, whose sides and tops were artificially done with bark. Upon the tops of most, and fastened to the ends of long poles, hang the locks of hair of Indians they have slain."
The Indians on the South Carolina coast and surrounding regions were pretty much terrified by the Westo, who had guns and were able to raid pretty much without restraint in all directions. They led to the depopulation of all of interior Georgia pretty much. They attacked the South Carolina coastal tribes, and among those coastal tribes, they were said to be afraid of the Westo to the point that they feared the very footsteps of the approaching Westo. Part of that was because they thought that the Westo were cannibals. The Westo probably were not cannibals, but what happened with the Westo that was different from other Indian societies, if somebody raided your town and took captives, they weren't taken far away, they had the possibility of escaping and returning, but people who were captured and taken away by the Westo never came back because they were sold as slaves to Virginia or farther north into New England or put on ships and shipped to the West Indies, so that people, once they were captured, were gone for good, and the only explanation that Carolina Indians had for that was the Westo must have consumed them.
Seen as an impediment to the expanding trade enterprise from Charleston, the Westo were doomed. Armed with firepower provided by the Carolina colony, the Shawnee or Savannah Indians overthrew the Westo in 1680. Their reward? To take over the trade with Charleston. Expansion into the fertile interior was now anchored by Fort Moore, located just across the Savannah River from present-day Augusta.
Actually, South Carolina was a great place to go because the land was still good, even if you lived in the interior and couldn't plant rice like the rich people on the coast. Not only did they like the fact that they could become more prosperous by settling this relatively cheap, easy, free land, but they liked the fact that it was far from Charleston's government. Settlers were always aware that to the west of them were the Native Americans. And to the east of the people here were slaves, and an uprising on either side would pin the people in Horse Creek Valley in. So it was reassuring to have a British presence there. You couldn't depend on the British to solve all your problems for you, but at least it helped. But on the other hand, as tensions rose, the very thing that attracted people in the Scots-Irish communities here, that they didn't have to deal with government, began to become a mixed blessing because the problems of the world were coming for them too.
Led by their chief, Squirrel King, a band of Chickasaw from an area in Mississippi answered the entreaties of the settlers. They became the buffer between the other hostile tribes like the Choctaw, Creek, and Cherokee. The Chickasaw were recognized as the guardians of the valley.
Well, the Chickasaw, after they settled in the Savannah River Valley, got caught up in the same deerskin trade and Indian slave trade that their predecessors had been involved in, though they arrived right at the end of both of those. So there were fewer and fewer Indian slaves being taken because of the decimation of the Indian population in the nearby regions, and also because deerskins were falling out of favor in clothing styles in Europe.
While Fort Moore offered the Native Americans a decent market for their skins and a good trade with the colonists, the protection of the fort enticed even more settlers from Europe to help themselves to Native American territory. The Chickasaw watched as the new colonists took up residence on their land.
The British had helped provoke the American Revolution in part by drawing a line in the sand, not too far west from here, and saying, colonists, settlers, you can't go any farther west because that's Native American territory, and we're going to protect it for the Native Americans. And that infuriated a lot of colonists and helped provoke the war. But from Native Americans, that made the British a better bet, and a lot of the Native American groups in this area did ally with the British.
The British had a solution. They granted the Chickasaw a 21,000-acre reserve along Horse Creek in 1739.
But even that didn't give them any protection because there was nobody really to enforce the boundaries. There were people moving in right away. Actually, there were probably already settlers living on that land when it was granted to the Chickasaw, and there was no way for the Chickasaw to remove them.
About the time of the Chickasaw land grant, an Irishman immigrated to the valley. George Golphin was well known for mixing his trading skills with his fascination for the native peoples. he became a vital link among the government officials in Charleston, the settlers, and the Indians.
A white trader with the Indians that doesn't treat them as though they're children, or that they're ignorant, or that they're just savages, but treats them as human beings, as equals for the most part, and to the point where he fits in with them, and he's not there to get them drunk and steal things from them or anything else. He treats them with respect.
Golphin married the daughter of a Creek chief, and they had several children he named as beneficiaries in his will.
That's so unusual, it's so unique, it's so different, and yet he does these things.
Although Golphin's sympathies were squarely with the Patriots, he still maintained his dealings with the British.
When the British seize his post and they control it, that Light Horse Harry Lee actually raids the trading post and captures, the supplies from the British. And so it's nothing against George Golphin. It's just that his site is actually involved in the Revolutionary War, and that the father of Robert E. Lee is the one who does the raid.
With the winding down of the French war against the Chickasaw in Mississippi, the Chickasaw in the valley began to return to their homelands. Now the settlers faced a decision about their future.
Well, I think we always have this idea that loyalists were people who ideologically supported the crown, and there were some of those, but in the backcountry, most people weren't driven by ideology. And a lot of people tried to avoid the question, who am I for as long as possible. That was a way to lose your land. That was a way to get involved in problems that a lot of ordinary people didn't want to worry about. But when the war came to their doorstep, when the first militia stole their cow, when the battle came to them, when a militia told them that if they didn't cooperate, they were going to have their crops and their houses burned down, then people had to choose a side, and staying out of it wasn't possible. But they didn't necessarily choose for ideological reasons. Communities tended to stick together, so if the local planter decided to be a loyalist and he was a community leader, then those people probably followed him. And if he decided to be a patriot, they followed him into the patriot cause. In many cases, they saw themselves as also protecting their own communities.
Just as the colonists were adjusting to their newfound independence, more people pushed their way into Horse Creek Valley. Also came the planters, who gobbled up large expanses of land on which to raise cotton.
It is self-evident that most of the slaves that were in South Carolina in particular were used in the field. This is a state that had found most of its income, if you will, was with landholders who had large plantations who would then have slaves to do all the agricultural work.
People who were not considered free steadily built their communities right alongside those who enslaved them. They tried as best they could to create a place for themselves within a system that regarded them only as property.
It's my understanding, I guess, that the slaves, when they were praising God, made such a loud noise and all until Lamar moved them down from their place down by the branch. I guess initially it was just like a wooded area or something like that. That's where they would meet and have their church. And maybe the storm did come up or something, but they named it Storm Branch. Actually, they say it was organized July the 9th, 1772. But the church was not built at that time. They were still out, I guess, under the harbor. Later on, somebody who worked at the pottery designed the blueprint for the church.
The same enthusiasm and ambition that had accompanied settlers to South Carolina's backcountry now became more visible in the landscape. In 1793, Eli Whitney perfected his cotton gin. just a little more than 100 miles down the Savannah River from Horse Creek Valley. His gin allowed more cotton to be processed in less time. For planters who held land in the valley, like the Lamars and the Hammonds, this innovation meant that great wealth was just about to arrive. It was the big city across the river, the city that seemed to get all the attention and all the trade, until one enterprising immigrant named Henry Schultz arrived from Hamburg, Germany.
In Augusta, Georgia in 1806, the first thing an immigrant does is push a pole boat up and down the Savannah River. And what these pole boats were doing was picking up local produce, carrying it down to Savannah, then getting manufactured items such as cigars, iron tools, cloth, paper, toting it back up the river to Augusta in a constant shuttle back and forth. As he went down the river, he saw these forests of cypress trees. And he looked at those and said, my God, they don't have anything like that in Europe. And he'd heard that these trees were imperishable. They literally last forever. And he thought, why can't we use this majestic timber to build a bridge, which is what Augusta really needs right now to make that city fly?
Schultz was possessed by an idea that would serve to drive him for the rest of his life: the joining of the valley in South Carolina to the commercial seaports in Savannah and Charleston.
At the time, it was just a howling wilderness. There was nothing over there. But there were farmers on the other side. And the farmers were desperate to bring their cotton and their produce over to Augusta so they could put onto a steamboat, carried down the river to Savannah, and sold for cash money. They must have talked to a ton of people in order to work up the many tens of thousands of dollars that it took to do the job. And in a matter of a year, the bridge was done and it was collecting tolls.
Schultz was proud of his accomplishment. So proud, in fact, that he could see even more opportunities on the horizon for himself and his magnificent bridge.
Schultz said, my bridge is better than gold. It's a solid item that's not going anywhere. It returns its value every 5 years. Gold doesn't remotely do that. So this is better, and I'm going to found a bank on the strongest of all possible assets, my bridge. It just happened that his bridge was involved in a mortgage, and the mortgage was not paid, and the bank that held that mortgage was willing to move heaven and earth to get their hands on that bridge, and they did so. And guess who is absolutely enraged by not having his beautiful bridge any longer? Henry Schultz. And who promised revenge for injuries? Henry Schultz. So he got a job on the riverfront. He was in charge of the Port Authority, and he could watch the traffic coming across his bridge. He was a very intelligent, very questing sort of man who turned everything over in his mind, looking for a way to get what he wanted. And I'm sure he thought that, wouldn't it be great if wagons were crossing the river in the other direction, carrying cotton to my town, instead of coming from South Carolina to carry cotton to Augusta.
So began the creation of a town that would see both the best of times and the worst of times. Schultz named his sweet revenge Hamburg. Once again, his dream of owning a successful upriver trading center was about to become a reality.
Horatio Allen pointed out that the power of a horse was known. It was set. A horse 100 years from now wouldn't be able to pull any more than a horse does today. But steam engines were a completely different matter. He said with perfect accuracy that nobody had any idea how far those would go in the coming years.
Charleston, once the epicenter for commerce on the East Coast, had become a third-rate port. The directors of the South Carolina Canal and Railroad Company were determined to reclaim their city's former position of power. In 1830, work began on the first large-scale steam railroad in the world. Also called the Charleston to Hamburg Railroad, its creation mirrored Henry Schultz's ambitions to stop South Carolina cotton from being transported down the river to Savannah, Georgia. In October of 1830, the best friend of Charleston was delivered. But, as Horatio Allen had said, steam engines were a completely different matter.
An engine that's powered up and under steam needs to have somebody watching it at all times to make sure nothing happens. And they learned that the hard way when one day in 1831, long before the railroad had even been finished to Hamburg, the best friend blew up.
From the rubble of the best friend rose the Phoenix, ready to run between Charleston and Hamburg. After 2 years of construction, they drove the last spike in 136 miles of track. From 1833 to 1842, it was the longest railroad in the world. At long last, the backcountry fields were directly linked to the ports of Charleston.
In the 1850s, railroads in South Carolina exploded, and so now a farmer could carry his cotton 10 miles, drop it off of a depot, and that's when Hamburg really began to suffer. And finally, by the time of the Civil War, it was a ghost town.
And Henry Schultz, who had made and lost several fortunes, died penniless in 1851. In his final act of revenge, he demanded that he be buried upright on the hill above Hamburg, with his backside facing Augusta. The very earth of the valley is singular and unique. Its place in world history is nothing short of extraordinary.
Below the fall line, to the southeast, those crystalline rocks are covered by much younger sedimentary rocks, sands, silts, clays, and limestones. They are wind-blown remnants of an old shoreline when the ocean was here and Horse Creek Valley would have been beachfront property.
Well, one of the best-known archaeological sites in the whole eastern United States is Stallings Island, which is just above Augusta, North Augusta, in the Savannah River on an island. What makes it important in the prehistory of this part of the world is the pottery that was being made there is called fiber-tempered pottery, or Stallings pottery. But the pottery that these people were making has produced the oldest dates for pottery in all of North America, around 4,500 years ago.
The Stallings people roamed Horse Creek Valley as well, where shards of their pottery are often found.
I find it fascinating that the geologic resources of this area have been studied for more than 150 years by some very famous people.
Dispatched by Governor Hammond in 1844, Michael Toomey, the state's first official geologist, mapped Horse Creek Valley.
He wrote, "The Aiken area affords one of the most remarkable exposures of clay in the United States."
The areas where all the Edgefield potteries were located, to some 25 or so of them, were on Horse Creek in the upper part of Horse Creek, where you have a different type of clay start to appear, and that's the clay that's needed to produce stoneware. These materials were found in the banks along Horse Creek. Back in the days of the Edgefield potteries, they had no way to remove overburden, so they typically set potteries up around creeks where the water had done the job for them and had eroded and washed away, and they could start digging into the banks. It was easier to get to.
Perhaps only once in a millennium does a person emerge with talents so rare as to never be forgotten. The enslaved man, known only as Dave for most of his life, was a potter of exceptional skill.
Dave was born about 1801. By the time he was 20, he was living in a small community called Pottersville, which was right outside Edgefield. At Pottersville, Dave learned not only how to turn pots, but also how to read and write. This was a risky thing for a slave to do, because in South Carolina, slave owners understood that even the smallest education could allow a slave to begin to ask questions and become less a slave and more a danger to the slavery system. He began to inscribe poems and dates and the name of his owner on the pots that he was making. He even went so far as to inscribe his own original poems on his pots. And somehow Dave, by daring to present his intelligence to the world, was able to get away with it. By hiding nothing, he was able to do anything.
Today, Dave's massive and fantastic jars belong to the permanent collections of prestigious museums, including the Smithsonian. The clay Dave and the other early potters dug was ideal for their vessels, but the valley held another prized resource. In the early 1800s, a type of clay was discovered here, white as cotton and just as valuable: kaolin. So, across the river from the big city, economic expansion was fueled by the land once again. The resources just below its surface were giving American industry a foothold in the South.
Colonel Thomas Davies Pottery was located in Bath. Actually, it was located in a hill above Bath and next to the town of Kaolin, which no longer exists. Colonel Thomas Davies made fire brick mainly at this plant. He also made crucibles and other things that were needed by Confederate industries.
The workforce at the Davies Pottery included slaves from the last documented slave ship to evade naval blockades. The Wanderer, which had been fraudulently obtained from the New York Yacht Club, made national news when it was discovered that she had returned from the African Congo with more than 400 captives packed below decks, defying a federal ban on the importation of slaves. 170 of them were delivered to a steamboat woodyard at Sandbar Ferry.
Undoubtedly, Davies had some of these wanderer slaves, as proven by records that exist. One of the single most important items that they possessed, it's called a bieri, and it's a bark basket, a woven bark basket, and on top is a crude face or head. The eyes and the teeth on this carved wood object have been outlined in white kaolin in Africa, and they consulted these before they planted or went to war in ceremonies. The style of face jug that was made at Colonel Thomas Davies Pottery had never been seen before at any of the other potteries in this area.
A man who saw the wanderer slaves wrote, 3 dozen Africans, tattoos racing across their brows and sharpened teeth showing behind parted lips, their dark eyes as wide and unbelieving as those of the farmers and merchants staring at them. Right next door to Davies' firebrick plant was Southern Porcelain Company. Founded by investors from Vermont, it was the maker of the only fineware china in the South.
After the outbreak of the Civil War, the northern interests that owned the factory left this area. So Southern Porcelain Company became controlled and owned by Alexander Stephens, who was the vice president of the Confederacy. At this point, it looks like they went into production of telegraph insulators, very crude objects that enabled them to string wire very fast in the field and get telegraph operations up and running.
For many years, Josiah Wedgwood required hundreds of tons of kaolin mined from the ridge above Horse Creek to make his fine English china. In the mid-19th century, South Carolina was a society focused on cotton, the growing of it, the selling of it, and the entire culture surrounding it. But heavy tariffs, passed by Congress in 1828 on the cotton trade, initiated an idea in Horse Creek Valley that would transform its character and its appearance forever. Why, planters asked, can't we keep our cotton here and manufacture our own cloth? One man rose to that challenge, finally succeeding where so many others who had tried had failed.
William Gregg is a man who was born in Virginia, comes down to Columbia, learns as an apprentice how to be a silversmith, then goes on to Charleston. And in Charleston in the 1840s, here's a man who is saying that South Carolina cannot remain an agrarian state.
Gentlemen planters with financial interests in and around Horse Creek Valley were fascinated with the notion of owning a textile mill. They recognized that the skill of weaving, practiced for centuries by artisans, could be industrialized, providing great profits for investors like themselves.
Two famous political figures in South Carolina during this time, George McDuffie and James Henry Hammond, play into this story. McDuffie was a leading spokesman for the nullification movement in South Carolina, which is going to come to its climax in the early 1830s when South Carolina almost goes to war against the United States.
Their first venture was the wooden Vaucluse mill, but the owners quickly learned just how easy it was for an employee to express discontent when it was burned to the ground in 1831.
So it's a sort of a repetitive story of people with interest in making money, I suppose, but not the willingness to put the time and effort into operating it, and perhaps just not enough knowledge. I mean, these were men whose understanding of economics was basically you buy land, you plant crops, you buy slaves, you harvest, you sell. And that was one thing that Gregg had that these other men did not have. He had the interest and the willingness to actually move to that area, to live there, and to be involved in the day-to-day management of the Vaucluse mill.
Gregg was a businessman with a clear vision of Horse Creek Valley as the textile manufacturing center of the South.
William Gregg recognized not only the importance of the flowing water through Horse Creek Valley, but also the potential energy that could be captured from the falls.
But William Gregg says, I don't know that much about textile mills and how they're run profitably, so I'm going to go to where they do know how to do it well.
In the summer of 1844, Gregg set out on what he termed a tour of inspection through the manufacturing districts of the northern states.
And so he goes to New Jersey and then on to Lowell, Massachusetts, where they do this thing well, and they are making money. And so he writes down in his diary, how long is the mill in Lowell? How wide is it? How much water power do you need to power how many spindles to maximize the profitability of your operation?
The mill would employ several hundred workers and would produce 14,000 yards of cotton cloth per day.
And he creates the town of Graniteville. And he's looking for, what's his labor force going to be? 1840s, what's a labor force going to be? Wrong, not slaves. He wants what he calls the poor whites.
He thought that the mill village would serve as a sort of a moral uplift opportunity for them. And this brings us back to his paternalism. It won't work unless we have a top-down managerial style that more or less forces these people who have never had anybody much tell them what to do, and in fact who treasure their independence. They may not have much in terms of the world's goods, but or at least they're on their own. They're ignorant, they're not well educated, and they're on sort of a dead-end street in terms of their life pattern. He's going to rescue them from this.
Beginning in 1846, a mill emerged from blocks of blue granite mined at the nearby quarry.
And then he builds the community. and he builds houses for his workers, and he builds churches, and he builds parks, and parks with fountains, and all these amazing things for his workers. And then he says that his workers' children from the ages of 6 to 12 are going to be in school. It's a compulsory school system. And what he's doing is he's saying that if your child is caught truant from school, I'm going to take you off the line, I'm going to fine you, and if it happens too often, you're going to lose your job. That's called parent responsibility. Wow, that's different.
Whereas in other mills, both in England and on this side of the ocean, children as young as 8, maybe even younger, were working. So he was progressive to that degree.
But what he's doing is brilliant, because he knows when these children turn 13 and are out of school, they're going to work in this mill. And they're going to work there probably for the rest of their lives. And if they know how to read and write and add and subtract before they even come into his mill, they're going to be able to read instructions, they're going to be able to count stitches, they're going to have a safer mill, and he's going to have better production.
By the fall of 1849, more than 300 mill workers were employed at Graniteville, and the town's population topped 900. For the next decade, though cotton decreased in price, Graniteville thrived, and its residents became company people, committed to the mill life, fiercely loyal to their community, and like everyone else at the time, bracing for a civil war.
William Gregg, he's not for the war. He is not for secession, like a Robert E. Lee, like a Alexander Hamilton Stevens, like a lot of people that it's still their state that they live in, that they come from, is important to them.
One of the cloths the Graniteville mill produced was of a coarse weave commissioned by the Confederate States of America for their Army uniforms. At the same time, the Bath paper mill, which had been built before the war, was called upon to produce the paper for Confederate currency.
On April 3rd, 1863, there's a fire in the Bath paper mill, and the place burns. We have articles from the Dallas newspaper, from the Memphis newspaper, from other newspapers throughout the Confederacy saying that they're going to be shutting down, or they'll go to maybe a half-page paper until they can find another source of newspaper stock, because there was a fire in the Bath paper mill in South Carolina. If you look at printed materials in 1864 and 1865, a lot of that is on the back of wallpaper, because there is no other source they can find for newspaper stock. So the Bath mill has tremendous, tremendous impact on the Civil War, because remember, newspapers are really the only source of information.
In February of 1865, Sherman issued orders for all the mills in Horse Creek Valley to be destroyed. Confederate General Fightin' Joe Wheeler saved the mills by leading his men in a fierce battle fought on the streets of nearby Aiken. By April, the South had lost the Civil War, and emancipation finally came to the enslaved. Although the New South was slow to adapt to the changes, William Gregg envisioned a future of growth and renewal. Despite his optimism, fate dealt him a different hand. In September of 1867, while directing the repair of a breach in Flat Rock Dam, Gregg contracted a fever and died. The end of the 19th century witnessed the creation of new mills throughout the valley. With Graniteville as the anchor of what became known as the Upper Valley, yet another mill was built on the old Vaucluse site. In time, it was followed by the Warren Mill on the other side of the creek. The Lower Valley welcomed the Langley Mill, several more mills in Bath, and the Clearwater finishing plant. Each one had its own village. Gregg's utopian dream slowly gave way to the new corporate ownership model emerging in the American textile industry. the independent mills were purchased by the United Merchants and Manufacturing Company of New York and the Seminole Mills of Florida.
The mills companies did hold strict control many times over their employees. They gave the people, quite a bit of freedom, even though we had the company stores, which everybody owed their soul to, Housing was very cheap, and you could rent a whole house, 4-room house, for about $5 a month. And the company maintained the house, maintained the streets, maintained the sewer systems, maintained the waterworks. The people, their allegiance was to that company.
The mills of Horse Creek Valley intensified production to supply even more cloth during World War I. The Great Depression hit everyone hard. After the panic subsided, people began asking questions about the value of their work. By the beginning of 1930, union organizers assured mill operatives that their skills were crucial to their employers. Before long, the cry was repeated among mill workers: fair pay for good labor.
And frankly, even when things hit rock bottom in the early and mid-1930s, the Southern labor force was still deeply divided on whether unionization was the way to go.
Roosevelt's New Deal offered a measure of hope, but operatives were caught in the middle. Rather than negotiate with union sympathizers, owners simply closed down the mills and hired armed guards to defend the perimeters from their own employees.
The president of the Graniteville Mill was the local administrator of the New Deal program for the textile industry, which is sort of like the fox watching the hen house, to use the old cliche. As workers began to realize that, they became increasingly frustrated at the lack of change. They believed that Roosevelt meant things to change, was on their side, was working for them, but they didn't see it translated into policies on the local level. And this made them much more receptive to the idea of a general strike.
Soon, the whole world would read about the troubles in Horse Creek Valley when, in 1933, Erskine Caldwell wrote a book entitled God's Little Acre. It was an unvarnished look into a culture with which Caldwell claimed to be familiar, and for which he had great empathy. Readers and critics were shocked and called the story indecent. For decades, Caldwell was forced to justify his publication and defend his gritty portrayal of his characters.
He wanted Horse Creek Valley because he wanted the reality of the shut mill. In those days, they just said the mill is shut. And this is the little man trying to get the machines going again. And we know how well that works out. Any controversy on the public's part or any resentment on his part always came when they implied that he wasn't writing about what he knew about. He knew very well what he was writing about, and he wrote about it very well.
In 1941, the mills of the valley answered their country's call once again. After World War II, the mill villages were a mirror of America. Although communities were focused on progress, they also took time out to enjoy themselves.
Baseball was very important to the mill villages. Every mill had its own baseball team. This is back during the teens, 20s, and 30s. And they would have their practice every Wednesday afternoon. You could go out and watch them practice. And then every Saturday afternoon, you would travel to one of the other mill villages for the big game of the week. And I remember as a youngster going out on a Saturday afternoon in these clay sand ballparks and sitting on these rickety stands and chicken wire behind the home plate and watching the ball game.
In the last 30 years of the 20th century, new buildings were constructed. Avondale Mills purchased the original Graniteville Company in 1996. But eventually, In spite of the efforts of the mill operatives, the wheels slowed, the number of spindles declined, and the yardage decreased.
One factor that I think helps explain the decline and demise of the cotton mill industry, the textile mill industry, even after the diversification that came along in the 60s and 70s with artificial fabrics coming in, and that sort of gave at least a temporary rejuvenation to the industry, is that old opportunity of outsourcing to Mexico, to other Central America locations, or worldwide to Southeast Asia, wherever it may be.
Those planters who had so long ago believed they could run a mill with ease would hardly recognize what had once been a quilt of cotton fields and acres of longleaf pine forests. And people who had been raised in the mill villages of Horse Creek Valley hardly recognized their hometowns. They anticipated a recovery, but like William Gregg, fate had a different challenge in store for them. At the same time the epic story of the mills was playing itself out by the waters of Horse Creek, a few miles away, the remnants of Henry Schultz's sleeping town of Hamburg were reclaimed by an entrepreneur, James U. Jackson. Like Schultz, Jackson also built a bridge. In 1891, he spanned the Savannah River to connect South Carolina to Georgia. But he wasn't aiming to compete with Augusta as Schultz had. On the contrary, Jackson intended to capitalize on his hometown's reputation, naming his new town North Augusta, South Carolina. By the turn of the century, his Hampton Terrace Hotel was the largest wooden structure in the world and a luxurious winter destination for America's most influential businessmen and celebrities. Jackson adopted a transportation system that made it easy for his guests to travel from the Augusta train station to his hotel across the river. The trolley served two popular resort towns on either end of Horse Creek Valley, North Augusta on the one end and Aiken on the other.
That you had on either end of this Mill Valley, you had some of the most powerful people in the United States, let alone the world, that came here for the winter months. Bing Crosby came down here to play golf. Fred Astaire came down here and spent many of his winters down here. Will Rogers came down here, wanted to learn how to play polo. John D. Rockefeller, Henry Ford, these are people that shaped American history. They came to this Horse Creek Valley area.
Just like the rest of the South, the area remained caught in the grip of segregation. But for a while, music built another kind of bridge in the valley.
Palmetto Park and Pond, I find, is a wonderful, wonderful story. Two guys get together and say, and we're going to promote this area. They build a pavilion that can seat 1,000 people. They have a barbecue area, and they also have a pond. Starting on May 12th, 1932, you have the finest jazz musicians in the world, international stars, that are coming to North Augusta, South Carolina. It's part of what's called the Chitlin Circuit. You have Dizzy Gillespie, Louis Armstrong, Ella Fitzgerald, Earl Father Hines, Cab Calloway and the Cotton Club Orchestra, Alan Simpkins from the town of Hamburg. It's very interesting that it should happen, and it did happen in Aiken County.
In the early 1950s, the construction of the Savannah River plant ushered in a new industrial age. Soon, businesses from around the world recognized, as had so many before them, the appeal of Aiken County and its resources. In the valley, the mills were struggling to survive. Yet, even in the face of foreign competition, there was still hope. Always, there was hope.
I raised 3 children in Graniteville, and it was a homey community, quiet, peaceful, You could hear the trains in the distance and the steam off the mills on occasions, but it was still just a peaceful place to be. And I thought it would be a great place for my children. And after they grew up and I remarried, I wanted to go back to that nice, quiet, peaceful town.
911, what's your emergency?
I think there's been a train wreck. Oh, God, I smell smoke.
Okay, ma'am.
I got to get out of here.
I'm going to get this smoke in the building.
Very early in the morning, we received a page, train derailment downtown Graniteville, possible fatalities.
911, where's your emergency? Something's wrong with the train. I woke up and now it just smells like not gas, but like a bleach, big cloud has come over the ground.
I knew that the mills downtown in Graniteville were running a midnight shift, and there would be a lot of people down there, not to mention a lot of people asleep in their beds.
911.
Hey, that's chlorine.
It's chlorine?
Yes, ma'am. We got that.
Where are you at?
I'm in Rocktown.
Okay,
And when we opened our bedroom door to go out into the living area, it was like somebody threw something at our face because our eyes started tearing up and our throats started closing up.
2 Norfolk Southern freight trains collided head-on a railroad track running parallel to Hickman Street.
When we left, there was a green fog out in the alleyway, and I knew that I had to get out of there.
And you got to remember, these were 3 90-ton tank cars with chlorine, and one of them had a hole in it and released the majority of that.
The people in Graniteville are resilient. They're strong. They're a committed group of people. They've worked every single day. They take care of their families. They love God. They take care of their community and their neighbor.
Because they had done it so often throughout their history, the people of Horse Creek Valley knew how to mend broken things. Just a few years before the train derailment, they'd worked together as a community to transform Langley Pond from a toxic waterway into something quite extraordinary.
I think there were many polluters of Langley Pond. There was a sudden awakening we need to protect the public better and identify these highly polluted bodies of water and even land. There was an immediate halt to polluting Langley Pond.
When Atlanta was chosen in 1990 to host the Summer Olympic Games, Langley Pond was identified as a possible training site for rowing activities related to the Games.
Volunteers, not a contractor, volunteers went out there in john boats with chainsaws and lowered the water level and cut the stumps off so that when the water level came up, the whole course would be free of stumps.
Since then, Langley Pond has welcomed top rowers from all over the world and serves as a natural venue for a number of other events. In the valley, the promise of spring always follows the challenges of a hard winter. While those who were lost will never be forgotten, once the grieving is done, backs straighten and eyes begin to focus on tomorrow.
The train wreck brought about a lot of interest from a lot of people. And so, out of a tragedy, some good things can occur. And so what we've been able to do in a partnership way is bring people and resources to bear on the federal, state, and local levels that I don't necessarily think we would have been able to facilitate without a tragedy occurring.
The structures that once resonated with the constant clicking of looms and the endless rattle of spindles sit in silence like sleeping giants. More than 1.5 million square feet of former manufacturing space, waiting for a new life.
It had survived for 150 plus years, but what are we going to do for the next 150 years? And now is the time that we can be able to do that. And I'm probably going to spend the next 15 years trying to make all of this stuff happen in conjunction with everybody else, so it's exciting.
From ocean waves that once rolled over its sand hills to the paved roads that now run beside its winding waters, Horse Creek Valley has cradled the people in every era who have stopped long enough to know it. And it's the people who take the time and make the effort to listen closely to its stories who will shape the tales that are yet to be told about Horse Creek Valley.